dropping this weekend. We've had it's interesting. We had the first mullet blow on the September 4th, and that was on the weekend.
Yeah.
And the last 2 weekends we've also had surges. Because they fall,
pulses. Yeah.
real noticeable pulses. And this weekend was pretty strong.
Yeah.
I know you were out on the beach picking
Yeah.
up trash, and you saw.
I noticed some cast netters out there throwing the cast into the wave and coming back, and the net itself looked like it was alive with fish. I couldn't tell what species or what fisheries it was, but nonetheless, they were catching some good size fish.
Yeah, they were really thick, and when they're thick like that, you get people that can actually reach them right from the surf line.
It looked like that.
You don't have to go out on the pier or something to do it. What's been a little disappointing though is the predatory response to this seems to be a little sluggish this year for some reason. And there is a pretty decent action right around the inlet areas, Bogue Inlet and Beaufort Inlet, with bluefish. We've actually seen bluefish have returned for.
A what fish? I haven't heard you say that word much.
BLUE, blue.
Bluefish. Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Not the red, white,
Yeah.
but the bluefish
Yeah.
have come back for at least for the fall or near fall. Spanish mackerel. We haven't seen many drum yet. On Friday, I fished around Bogue Pier in the surf, and I got a undersized, out of date flounder. Fine, big deal.
Yeah.
And I still am into citation lizardfish. And
I think once we started talking about lizardfish on this show, they started popping up. They started appearing.
Big ones.
Yeah,
these are big fish.
Yeah, nasty.
And in fact, I've been catching up in the creek. So I ended up going on Saturday and Sunday. I fished in one of the creeks on Saturday. Didn't do much there. I did lose one drum there. I hooked one on a plastic shrimp, and lost that one. Fished also up in Emerald Isle Woods. I was hoping to find some drum on topwater there. Right now, with the moon phase as it is, we get those early morning high tides, and so I can throw topwater baits around Emerald Isle Woods right over the top of those big oyster bars there. I've seen drum actually tailing right on those bars. It's funny, we've seen those bars will attract a lot of fish, as we know. Some of the biggest sheep's head I ever saw was snooping around one of those oyster bars, because we didn't have any bait. Metal, plastic, sometimes wood, and that's all we had. All we could do was look down and see an 8 or 10 pound sheep's head snipping around a
cruncher muncher.
Boy, one of those big oyster bars right up Core Creek. There's a big bay to the left as you're going up Core Creek, and in there's a big oyster bar that runs. It's in the middle area somewhere, where we've run along the edges looking for the drum. And boy, there was a big, just was awesome just to see him. So it was a little disappointing for me, because I I didn't get the drum I hoped for. One of the other things, we see the mullet out there, and there's still plenty of silver sides around, but I still haven't seen those brown clouds out there, the anchovies. I'm not sure where they are. I know there was some reported a few weeks ago out towards Cape Lookout, getting blasted by the false albacore and the Spanish mackerel, but I haven't seen them along the surf yet. And this time of year, you really do see them, especially on that northeast wind.
Yeah,
and you saw how clear the water was and how calm it was this weekend.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too. You mentioned that, and I was out Sunday, and the clarity of the water was brilliant. And there was a woman made a comment to her husband. Look at that area out there, and it was a browner shade. And I had my sunglasses on, but it could have been that massive fish that this woman saw, kind of going through that clear water right offshore.
Yeah, there could have been a number of things. It could be the mullet. It could be that there were some menhaden schools coming down the beach as well. Yeah, and they will give you a dark. In fact, it'll look a bit. If you look, what I do is, first thing I do is look up in the sky, see if there's a cloud up there.
Yeah, good point.
Because you get fooled. People get fooled sometimes with the shadow of a cloud, thinking it's a school of fish down there. Yeah. But I've seen that happen.
I've also seen the Air Force out there too. The pelicans are starting to get close to the surf too, so that means there's fish out in the water.
And you can tell they're bigger fish, not the anchovies, because of the way they dive. They dive almost straight down when they're going for the big stuff, either menhaden or the mullet as well. The other thing that I've noticed over the past few weeks, people have shown, and I've seen pictures of it, so I know this is true, and they not just a figment of their imagination, but there have been tarpon, baby tarpon, not juvenile, really baby tarpon. These fish are the size of the mullet.
Yeah.
And so these are really juvenile. And I talked to one of my marine biology buddies who used to live down the road from me, and he said we see, of course, we do see sometimes snook and bonefish come in from the Gulf Stream.
Right.
Those are more adult, young adult fish. And these sometimes, he said that sometimes the larvae of the tarpon have a very complicated life cycle. But sometimes those larvae will get swept up by the Gulf Stream and they come in towards the coastline. So, but I've seen more of that lately. And I don't know if you saw the picture, talk about stuff that's in the water. The manatees. There was that picture of the, I don't know, there's probably the collective noun for a bunch of manatees. But there was like a half a dozen of them. Usually you see one or two stragglers, but this was a group. This looked like a submarine attack on Morehead City. It really looked like that. That was pretty impressive. We've seen them occasionally.
We usually get one or two a season that comes up here.
Yeah.
We had one at Dudley's over in Swansboro.
Yeah, they come inside around the White Oak and in that backwater area. The other thing, I wanted to see how the old drum fishing is going. So I talked to Captain Gary Dubiel, and he said if you know where to go, they're still biting pretty good.
Ooh, okay.
And so what this also means is we're getting towards the end of that season as we get into October. And so those fish are going to be coming back out,
Yeah.
and the fishing along the beach will pick up for them. A lot of people will catch them now using, often night fishing using cut bait in the surf. So we'll see them right along the beaches. And what we've seen over the past few years is the piers out of, especially Seaview Pier, which is just out of New River Inlet. We'll catch bunches of them because they spawn up in the New River as well.
Mm-hmm. Your water temperature is still hanging in the 80s, but you tell me with your data that you've compiled over the last 30 years, that's about to change. The front's moving through this week.
Yeah, we'll see 70s really soon, and then we won't see 80s again until
next spring.
Next spring or late spring. Yeah.
Will that start to draw the trout? Will they be more prevalent?
Absolutely. Yeah. I caught that one trout up in one of the creeks a week or so ago.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for that. That's why I was trying on the weekend, see if I could
You
sniff
think
out a
that
couple of trout.
you think that fish you caught 2 weeks ago was a scout trout?
Not scout trout, yeah. They do that. We know, we've seen the scout
fish have
mullet.
scouts, that's right.
They absolutely do.
Very good. Any more in your fishing report?
We're done for that today.
We can go to let's go to a break here, and when we return, we'll have more of our Dr. Bogus fishing report, and you can join the conversation. 252-222-4848. We also have with us Jason Peters from the Division of Marine Fisheries. We'll be talking about the restoration of the oysters in eastern North Carolina. We'll be right back after this quick timeout. Welcome back to Dr. Bogus and our fishing report. You can also catch Dr. Bogus online at ncoif.com, and he's published each Wednesday in the Carteret News-Times. Doc, I'll let you introduce our guest this morning.
Yeah, we have coming back to us, we had Jason here. This is Jason Peters from Marine Fisheries. And there's a project well, first of all, why don't you give people a little idea what your background is, Jason?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Bogus. So as you said, I'm Jason Peters. Really glad to be back here today. I think this is maybe my second visit. Hope to be invited back again, maybe. We'll see how today goes.
We'll see how today goes, that's right.
But yeah, so I work at the Division of Marine Fisheries. I work for their Habitat and Enhancement section. My title is officially Enhancement Program Supervisor. So what that means for me is that I oversee all the enhancement or reef enhancement work that we do there.
Which
artificial reefs.
Which is a very busy part of the duties of the marine fisheries
yes,
here.
Yes, it really is, but I like to say it's more of a feel-good side of fisheries. You know, we give something back, and so I oversee the artificial reef program, the mulch planting program, which is a program we'll talk about today, and then the oyster sanctuary program.
Okay, we're going to talk about the oyster restoration. That's part of the restoration of things. But why don't you give people a little bit of the basic biology of oysters? So, because it plays an important role in restoring these reefs. It's an important consideration.
Absolutely. Yep. So I'm an ecologist by training, which means I studied how organisms interact with their environment. Oysters start out essentially as larvae. So oysters will spawn in the water column. males and females put their seeds in the water column. They'll fertilize. The larvae will travel through the water for about 2 weeks, and then after that point, they'll develop to a point where they settle on suitable habitat, hard rock substrate or other oyster reefs, and then they'll live there for the rest of their lives.
Which is how long?
Well, it sort of depends on where they are, but in North Carolina, we see 3-4 years maybe max.
That's the life cycle, yeah.
Yep. Yes, sir.
About 3 or 4 years. So how long has the restoration project been in? I remember a few years ago when you were requesting people dropping off shells, and so
Yep.
I know that was it's been around for a bit.
Sure. Yeah, quite a bit of time actually. So we've got 2 main programs at the division. One is what we call the culch planting program, and the other is the oyster sanctuary. And the culch planting really is where restoration started with the division and with the state, and that's been around in some form or fashion since about 1915. So we're over 100 years now doing restoration in the state.
Okay, what is the health of the oysters in North Carolina at this point? I know we're trying to restore things, but what is it compared to the historical background of the oyster habitat and the economics of that?
Sure, absolutely. So in the 1800s, really mid to late 1800s, I would say we were at sort of peak for our oyster populations, and at that point, really harvest increased substantially, and we haven't rebounded from that. So we're about 10% of historical max from the 1800s.
And that's been for quite some time. I went back and looked at Marine Fisheries website on the harvest over the past, I don't know, 20 or 25 years or so, and it's there are ups and downs obviously, but there really hasn't been a big change. Even from 20 years ago, it didn't seem.
Right. Yeah. Well, there are quite a few pressures that we're seeing on oysters now that can affect their populations. Of course, we're seeing higher frequency of hurricanes, which affect the salinity and the sounds, and more intensive agriculture and land development, and all of those things, harvest, of course, all of those factors really can affect oysters, and hence the need for restoration, a strong restoration effort to sort of maintain populations at a harvestable level.
In North Carolina, geographically speaking, what is the distribution of, are they generally through the whole from north to south, or what does that look like?
Absolutely, yep. Well, oysters, of course, they exist all the way from the Gulf Coast on up to Maine. So
right.
we've got them throughout coastal North Carolina, anywhere where salinities are greater than about 12 parts per thousand, or say maybe from the mouth of the Neuse eastward, can support oysters.
Now, the big part of this program is collecting and distributing the oyster shells on reefs, and that obviously, the oyster shells and what other things are good substrates for the larvae to affix to?
Yeah, so oyster shells are obviously, that's the natural.
Yep.
That's what oysters settle on, so we know that works. That's great, but they're not always available to us, and of course they're quite expensive. So we look to alternatives. The main one that we use is it's actually a fossil type of shell. It's fossil limestone, and we get quite a bit of it, marine limestone marl, that is mined in New Bern. So it's sourced in New Bern, and then we spread that throughout the Sound as our primary alternative.
What are the since we know the size of oyster shells, what are the size of the other stuff that you distribute? That's probably a critical part too, right?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned our 2 different programs. Culch planting program is intended really to support a wild harvest, and so we use smaller materials that can be picked up in tongs or dredges or things of that nature, or hand harvested, so much smaller, maybe 2 inches. Of course, the method that we distribute them is via our fleet of 5 vessels with water monitors. So we blast them off of the side, and of course that means we have to have a little bit smaller material. In the sanctuary program, we're building much higher relief, sort of big mountains, more of a long-term insurance policy on our oyster population. And we're building with much larger, maybe 12, 14, even larger pieces of limestone marl or concrete in some cases to build those because they're closed harvest. People don't need to go in there and excavate or anything like that.
Yeah, I saw a story in one of the publications recently, and it was pretty impressive. This big boat with looks like tons of oyster shells on it. Can you describe a typical day when you're dumping oyster shells?
Yep, absolutely. I think in that article, that image that you saw was an image from our Oyster Sanctuary program, and we build about 10 acres a year. What you were seeing there was a barge. We partner up with the North Carolina Coastal Federation, or we have for the last several years, and we've got a contractor that comes in, a North Carolina contractor, and takes about 1,500 tons of that material in a single barge load to the reef site, and then of course in a given year we'll do maybe 12 to 15 of those barge loads for a 10-acre site.
10-acre site. That seems like a thankless job. I mean, it seems like you got to put a lot of stuff down to make an impact on the situation with the oysters. And we've obviously taken up, over the years, we've taken a lot of oyster shell out, and now we're trying to get it back where it belongs. Sure,
absolutely. Yep. So we've got a bin at Fisheries, Marine Fisheries. Anybody that has oyster shells, we certainly collect them. And they go a long way to helping our culture planting program and restoring the oyster populations.
You know, if I could ask a question, Jason, you talk about the economic impact that oysters have on the economy as far as harvesting and then people consume it. But speak from a point from the ecology, the environment. How much water does one oyster filter in a day?
Yeah, great question. So there's a lot of controversy over that number. But reports up to about 50 gallons a day.
That's incredible.
Really incredible, yeah. And we were talking on one of the breaks about scaling that up. And so we sample on a per meter squared, so 1 meter by 1 meter, and we can see 200-300 oysters in that single meter. And then you talk about acres of that times 50 gallons. It's a lot of water that we're filtering, and that means a lot economically. Clean water, better fisheries. That brings people here to Eastern North Carolina.
That's an amazing statistic. We'll take a break here, and when we return, more of our fishing report with Dr. Bogus, and we're joined by Division of Marine Fisheries, Jason Peters, talking about the restoration efforts taking place here in North Carolina to restore the oyster reefs. We'll be right back.
We have Jason Peters from Marine Fisheries. We're talking about the oyster restoration project there. The habitat that you're generating out there, a lot of this is available, at least can be determined where it is. It's published on the Marine Fisheries website, right?
Yeah, it sure is. And I like to point folks to the trusty Google, just to Google NCDMF. You can type Oyster Sanctuary or Culture Planting or Oysters, and you'll find our main page. And on that page, there's a link to an interactive map. You can see all of the habitat that we've got out there, culture planting and oyster sanctuary, and artificial reefs for that.
And it's really good for the artificial reefs as well. Now, what are some of your recent accomplishments there? I know you've done a lot of work around the Cedar Island area.
Yep.
In the bombing ranges and all.
Yep, absolutely. So that's sort of our crowning achievement in the last year. We finished up a 60-acre site at what we call Swan Island Oyster Sanctuary. Again, that was in partnership with the
I fished there.
Yeah, and really a great spot for old drum fishing. You mentioned that in your report earlier.
Right.
All of those reefs hold big drum. So that was our big one. And then, of course, we started our next sanctuary site at Cedar Island, and we built about 10 acres this past year.
Now, what does that look like going forward? You have stable funding to do this, and what is your plans over the next 5 or 10 years?
Absolutely. Well, we plan to continue a partnership with the Coastal Federations. We've been able to leverage sort of a 50-50. We pay half, they pay half every year, and it's doubled the amount of habitat we've been able to build. We've been really fortunate. Our funding comes from the General Assembly, almost exclusively, at least our portion at the division, and we've been very fortunate to have strong funding for the previous 5 years, and we're hopeful to continue that strong funding.
Now, some of these reefs, some of them are sanctuaries. Meaning, does that mean that those are off limits as far as harvesting goes? But there are other areas that you can harvest where you're creating these reefs?
Correct, yep. So our Oyster Sanctuary program, I mentioned before, they're much more complex, larger areas, but they are closed to harvest. We build them as sort of an insurance policy to provide those larvae that we talked about to the rest of the system, and then the culch reefs are open harvest, smaller materials so that they can be collected.
Right, and as a fisherman, I know those reefs are very productive. I was just fishing over the weekend in a place called Emerald Isle Woods, and right off the end of that dock there is a big oyster reef, and I liked when I was able to fish at the high tide. I can fish right over the top of the reef looking for red drum. But what other fish tend to accumulate right around those reefs?
Sure. Well, of course, we know that trout, spotted sea trout, but weakfish also love these sites. We see sheep's head quite frequently. Seasonally, of course, maybe not so much of a fishery, but we do see groupers and sea bass using the habitat for
The juveniles.
for refuge. The juveniles, yep.
Yeah.
And then red drum.
Very good.
Thank you,
Gentlemen,
Jason.
Jason Peters from the Division of Marine Fisheries. Thanks for coming in this morning.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope to be invited back.
Absolutely.
will.
You will be coming back. And Doc Bogus, you'll be coming back next Monday.
See you next Monday,
Very
Mike.
good. Thanks. And you can read Doc Bogus in the Wednesday Carteret News Times or go online to ncoif.com. We'll be back after this top of the hour break.